And welcome back. The Legal Aid Society's Racial Justice Unit aims to tackle issues of racial justice and equity both in the courtroom and within the city's largest legal services group. They work to ensure organizational policies, practices, and systems fit within racial equity framework. The RJU raises critical awareness of the systemic oppression communities of color experience through the use of research, public policy advocacy, impact litigation, community engagement, and strategic communication. This unit is grounded in principles of racial equity and social justice, providing visionary and strategic leadership to ensure every facet of their organization promotes racial justice. Here to provide her point of view on this matter, I'm joined by supervising attorney at Legal Aid, Ann Oredeko. And thank you so much, Ann, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Good. And so I want to talk a little bit, first of all, about the work that you guys are doing in your racial justice unit. When we talk about social justice, we know that a part of social justice is the racial inequities that people have to contend with. So share with us a little bit about the work that you're doing there with some of the racial inequities that we're seeing across our city.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting working at the Legal Aid Society. As you may know, we work in so many different areas of law that impacts communities of color, especially low-income communities of color. So my work kind of cuts across all of the practices of the Legal Aid Society. So we do juvenile rights work. So we work with kids who are being removed from their families in ACS cases, as well as representing young people who are charged with criminal offenses in family court. We also do work in the criminal justice sphere with our public defender office, our trial attorney offices, where we represent the vast majority of people who are accused of crimes in all 5 boroughs. Additionally, we do appellate work, we do prisoners' rights work, we have the decarceration project that's aiming to try to depopulate jails in our city, and also push for policies that will depopulate pretrial incarcerated people throughout New York State. And then we also have our civil practice that does more than you can even think about. We do immigration work, we represent people in housing court, we deal with health advocacy. We also work with communities that are facing gentrification to support small businesses. So our work cuts across anything that might impact a low-income person, specifically, more than likely, a person of color. As we know, New York City is full of economic inequalities, and those inequalities, like Black and brown people, bear the brunt of those things, right? So Black and brown people are more likely to be low-income New Yorkers. And so our work essentially is to serve them and to help them confront these systems that are created in a way to ensure that inequality continues and that it's generational. For economic inequality is generational, and incarceration is more likely to be generational as well through the current systems that we live with.
Yeah, and when we talk about some of the things that we're dealing with here is for low income individuals, one of those things is the issue of bail. And we know that the bail reform law that's out there, a lot of controversy surrounding that, but I know that you're doing some work with regards to bail. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the sad thing, it's really frustrating that the bail reform that we had achieved last session was quickly rolled back before we could even implement it. There was already a public push, not even a public push, right? It was very much the police, PBA, as well as the media that was used as a tool by the PBA to really change the narrative around what is fair and around safety. They really try to take 1 or 2 off cases to make it seem like an epidemic was happening. And it's frustrating because we know who is still going to be harmed, right? We were able to salvage some pieces of that, and the bail reform that we originally had was already a compromise, to be frank, right? We worked with DAs, we worked with multiple groups to be able to get to that place. And then for the inroad to happen, to roll it back, it became frustrating to watch something that we fought hard to get for people who are already being in systems, to see it watered down even further. It's still in effect. For most misdemeanors, you cannot have any bail set. the vast majority of cases, and the biggest fear that we were facing was whether dangerousness would be put into our bail statute, which has never been a part of the New York bail statute.
Mm.
And I think it's really important, especially for Black people, to really recognize why dangerousness is a terrible phrase to have in any criminal justice statute, just because of the way racism functions and anti-Blackness functions in this country. We are inherently seen as dangerous, right? So when we're looking at police murders, when we're looking at police brutality, oftentimes the crux, the unspoken thing is that inherently a Black man is seen as dangerous. Inherently a Black person or Black communities are seen as dangerous. So when police use excessive violence or murder to like try to control us as Black people, our culture in this country really struggles to confront that underlying anti-Blackness, right? To really confront what they're saying when a police officer says, I was afraid that this unarmed or a 12-year-old playing with a toy gun like is doing, right? So if our bail statute had incorporated dangerousness, we'd be looking at a significantly higher rate of incarceration pre-trial for Black and Brown people, specifically Black people, because we will be seen as dangerous by the courts. We're already battling that, and the language is not there. So there were some wins in that we were able to protect certain things, but generally speaking, it's disappointing to see that change.
Mm-hmm. Talk to me about defunding the police, because that's a major talk that's been out there right now about defunding police, taking money away from the police department, redirecting it and allocating it in other ways that could possibly better serve the community. Your thoughts about that?
I mean, I'm all for it. If you want my thoughts, I'm like, yes, take money from their bucket because they have the biggest share. They have the lion's share of our budget. And as we can see, even with the way that our budget came down this year, we are still seeing violent crime. And the reason why people were predicting that we'll see an increase in violent crime this summer, long before the push for defund, long before any of the stuff that's happened in recent months. But back in March, when they were already talking about getting rid of the summer youth program, right? Or when they were talking about reducing funding for some of the arts programming and other programming, or especially when they were talking about reducing the money going to our Department of Education. The reason why people were predicting that violence was going to increase was because we knew that those structures, those community engagements that young people have access to, one, provides actual financial needs for families. It's not just like a young person being able to go shopping, like families budget for that money. Mm-hmm. Two, it provides access to other types of engagement that doesn't leave them with very little support, right? A lot of our young kids in our communities, especially our kids of color, do not have access to, tennis tutors and swim lessons. A lot of them are essentially supporting younger siblings and supporting family members in whatever economic means they can. And so the uptick in violence only indicates that not that bail reform changed anything. Bail reform was already in place and we didn't see any change. It actually more so reflects the fact that we have not invested in our communities. So when people are demanding defund the police, we're naming the fact that the police haven't created extra safety. We have one of the largest police forces in the world. Actually, if you look at the NYPD, you can name it as one of the biggest militaries globally. And yet our city still sees violent crime. So it's not having more police that creates safety. What creates safety is people having their needs met, right? Mm-hmm. Making sure that folks have access to healthcare and not just the worst version of healthcare, but like substantially better healthcare, including mental health access, and not just with social workers who also within systems of oppression, everyone is touched by that. So it's not just having social workers come in, it's also making sure that we have people who are adept to address the needs of communities of color and not bring in white supremacist ideologies or pathologizing our communities. It's also making sure people have access to good jobs and jobs that don't exploit our communities, right? So you're not doing work that is toxic or harmful to you. You're doing work that pays well. That gives you access to a better life than what you were able to have before getting that job, right? So we have a budget, we have our tax dollars, and our city consistently makes the choice to reinvest in things that are not actually providing people with getting their needs met, which then creates the system of a cyclical system of poverty, which oftentimes when you look at communities that are poor, people are desperate. And when people are desperate, they oftentimes do things that are antisocial. So if we really want to attack the underlying issue of what makes harm happen, what makes violence happen, we have to attack the fact that we are not investing in our communities. We're investing in the police who consistently come in, harass Black and Brown people in our communities, are harmful to us, right? Like if you talk to anybody who's like 17 in this city and you ask them if they're a person of color and they live in Brownsville or East New York or Flatbush, they're going to tell you that they don't enjoy interacting with the police because the police treat them like they're dangerous. Going back to the language that we're saying around anti-Blackness, right? Like they treat them like they are villains when they're just young people trying to live their lives.
Yeah, and when we talk about young people living their lives, I mean, you think about the amount of challenge that they actually face in life, and one, you don't want it to be the NYPD, but unfortunately for many people of color, that's a real fact that their interactions with police, some are warranted, yes, but the unwarranted are what I think most of America does not really get the full grasp and the understanding about. Being Black in America has definitely been uh, when I tell people, and I've had conversations before about, being Black in America, when I tell people you really don't understand, the gravity sometimes of the weight of what it means to carry a skin color, that sometimes you're just hated just on the basis of your skin color. And I know that you're also doing work with hate crimes too, right? And we're seeing recent hate crimes increase here in New York City. What's been your office's response to this rise that we're seeing of hate crimes?
I mean, I think oftentimes when you look at hate crimes and the use of trying to police hate crimes, what you end up finding is that the communities that are supposed to be protected by that legislation end up being the ones most likely to be prosecuted by it, right? So, legal aid, I think we discussed in the media before having a client who was a queer person who was also prosecuted for committing a hate crime against another queer person, right? You oftentimes see already marginalized people. So I'm talking about trans people. I'm talking about trans people of color, trans women of color, especially. Um, Black people and other marginalized groups are the ones more likely to be prosecuted under hate crime legislation. I really wrestle with the idea of trying to use the criminal justice system to reform or change people's behavior, right? We look at hate crimes as incidents that are very public, but I think when we talk about hate crime, we don't talk about societal hate crimes, right? The fact that the vast majority of Black and Brown children in this city go to overcrowded, underfunded, and honestly not well managed schools, that is a hate crime. That is a hate crime towards our children, right? When we look at the fact that for the vast majority of Black people and Brown people in our city, we were the hardest impacted by COVID-19. And to be honest, we are still waiting for the second wave. So we don't even know what those numbers are going to actually look like by the time this pandemic is over. And because we don't have access to proper healthcare prior to this crisis, we live in communities that are more likely to have environmental factors that detrimentally impact our health. And we live in a society that creates such tension, anxiety, and stress on our bodies, but because of the fact that we live in this color of our skin, right? The fact that we are Black, the fact that we are non-white people, we have extra stress just by living a daily life. That is a hate crime. And yet we don't prosecute our city government officials for that. We don't legislate that, but we try to control individual behavior when we really should be talking about what societal choices are we making? How can we change that behavior to actually give people the ability to live? Not just like, no, forget live, thrive. I don't want to just live. I want to thrive. I want my children to be able to thrive. I want my family to thrive. I want my friends to thrive, right? So yes, I'm not supporting hate crime legislation, especially I think recently they're trying to, and maybe this has changed. I haven't stayed up on this, to be honest, but I know that they were trying to make harming a police officer a hate crime when we already have legislation that makes harming any public official bumped up to a felony. So if you were to slap a police officer, that is a felony assault. So adding the hate crime legislation, overdoing
Over.
it to say the least.
Right. Right. Excessive.
Excessive. Thank you. You know what? Excessive. I'll leave it there because I can't
Yeah.
say the word right now.
Yeah, no, it is, and I think it's a lot of things that sometimes we don't really pay attention to because we know that there are protections already in place for law enforcement. We know that if you do strike that officer, you are gonna pay a heavier penalty than if you do a regular individual. It's already bumped up, and so good point there talking about that. Before we go, I want to get a chance to talk to you a little bit about this one thing, abolishing. Come on and share with us a little bit about abolishing.
Oh, let's abolish. Yes, I'm here for this. So oftentimes I think people feel anxious around conversations around abolishing the police or abolishing prisons and jails because people really do fear for safety, right? And I think that's a genuine concern because humans are flawed. We are not perfect. We harm people even if it's unintentional, and we harm people even when it is intentional. But having our state weaponize its ability to control violence because of the way this country was formed. We as Black people especially have to recognize the fact that we will always be used as fodder to create an illusion of safety that doesn't exist, right? So with police abolition, when we talk about safety, and we talked about this earlier in our conversation, it is very clear that when you see the safest communities, you see communities that have everyone's needs met, or people have access to be able to get their needs met, right? Policing as a whole, if you look at how it grew up in this country, and even when you look at like policing as it started in Europe, right? Like it was used by the British to try to ensure that the Scottish and Irish people that they were trying to dominate would adhere to their rules, right? And then you see how it came to be in this country. It started with slave patrols in the South. It started in the North as a mechanism to control labor. It was capitalists who pushed to be able to ensure that they forced people to work, even in conditions that were not safe. Like that's how policing started, especially even here in New York. So when you think about this system, it was never really created to create safety. It was created to ensure the interests of those with money, the interests of those with power are enforced with violence, right? And so if we are trying to live in a society that actually reflects the need for everyone to be safe, as well as the need for everyone to have access to resources, and that is refusing to use violence as a tool or a mechanism to control populations, we have to think about abolishing the police, right? Like they were never designed for what we keep trying to force them to do. And even the police will acknowledge that. Like when they are sent to deal with like somebody in mental health crisis, they know they have no business doing that. They're not trained for that. And yet here we are, right? Or when the police are told to go into certain communities, what they end up doing oftentimes is harassing the people in those communities that behave like an occupying force, right? Moving on to other parts of abolition, because we don't have to just stay there when we talk about police abolition, we also have to think about jails and prisons. When people are incarcerated, even for the most heinous crimes, the vast majority of them at some point will come back to our communities. We know that prison especially does not give people the tools they need to come back to our communities and be healthy, productive members of our society. If anything, we know that they are going to be given a scarlet letter that would keep them from being able to access many things that they need to be able to ensure that they can provide for themselves and their families. Mm-hmm. So we set them up for failure. And we torture them prior to sending them back into community where they're set up for failure, right? Like if somebody was to ask you right now, I'll give you $100,000 for you to stay in prison for 20 years. Would you sign up for that? No, like nobody would. Because we know that it's not a place in which it's not a life-giving place. It's a place that literally is full of death and suffering. And it's toxic for the people who even work there, right? So if you go and meet with corrections officers, there is something that starts to shift in people's brains when they are given like ability to be in power over other people and use violence against other people. And so you see like an uptick with law enforcement officers across the board of self-harm or violence in families. So I'm talking about domestic violence. You see an uptick because we are literally creating systems of violence that do nothing but feed into violence, feed more violence into our communities, even if it's indirectly. And so for Black people and brown people in this country, specifically Black and Latinx people, we are pushed into these systems, right? We're pushed into jails and prisons. We're also pushed into positions where we are the people who are corrections officers, because that is one of the few jobs that pays well in our communities.
Mhm.
And then you see cycles of violence continue. You see parents who are more abusive. You see partners who are more abusive. You see people being violent with their family members because we are literally training them how to be more violent. So we want a society that actually is safe, a society that doesn't um, feed off of the blood of our communities. We have to get rid of these systems, and we have to think of creative ways to deal with harm. Because truth be told, we still have murder, we still have rape, we still have child abuse, all these things still happen. So we're not even successful with the systems we have now, right? The vast majority of people who are raped do not report it. Most people out there who are rapists have never been brought to account. There is no accountability for that behavior. And yet we pretend as if our society is safer. So, how can we actually start to change the way we think about accountability, the way we think about safety, the way we think about moving away from punishment and torture into actually giving people the tools they need to be better people to each other?
And Oredeko, we got to leave it there, but I want you to know that we want you to come back to the Racial Justice and Social Justice Forum to talk about racial justice and continue this conversation. I think that there's a lot of things, layers that unfortunately we as a society don't pay attention to. And when we take a deeper look at them and we understand them a little bit more in a holistic way, there's an education that people are getting. And unfortunately, a lot of people have been living in ignorance. But nowadays, it seems as though the light is coming on. But thank you for shining your light and shining the light on a lot of different topics. And of course, we got to have you come back and share more with us more on some of these other matters.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate this conversation.